Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Rose and Rubiani podcast, Making Sense of This World. Lots going on, but this week we're dialing in on the biggest threat that everyone seems to have been speaking about for many years now. But post sort of Russia, Ukraine has become really dominating everyone's mind. The prospect or the specter of a war between the U.S. and China, possibly triggered by Taiwan, which very much has the potential to turn into a World War III kind of scenario. So it's scary stuff, but I think maybe it's useful to start out by laying some of the background on this, because we've seen a lot of bluster in the last year or so, and there's been some interesting developments in the last few weeks. Could you catch us up to those, Bruno?
Sure. So we have discussed so many times about the polarization of the world between US and China, US allies and China's allies, and those countries that are caught in the middle, potential countries that can be battlefields for proxy wars. And then we said India is in the position of choosing or hedging their bets. We've discussed these things so many times. And yet there seems to have been recently a sort of acceleration in this process. Effectively, we have discussed so many times that US and China are in a sort of new Cold War II, we called. And we also reminded how Graham Allison, the Harvard scholar, said these two countries headed for a war, so a conflict, hot war, I mean, not Cold War. And last week, a memo from a general, an Air Force general from the US Armed Force, was somehow either leaked or seen, anyway, reported about by the FT and other newspaper. And that memo says that in the views or in the guts, the way he puts it, of this general, a conflict, a real exchange, military exchange between the two superpowers might happen as early as by 2020-25. So which is like tomorrow in today's terms. That seems a bit of an acceleration to us, but we ask ourselves in this column, what's the background? How is it possible that may happen? And of course, the general gives the potential trigger, which is Taiwan.
Let's dig a bit deeper into that specific memo, because 2025 is like you said, basically tomorrow in sort of today's pace of things, but it also sort of signals a change in US strategy, because for a really long time it's been this policy of quote unquote strategic ambiguity, the sort of sense of ambivalence over whether or not the US would actually come to Taiwan's rescue were something to go down. Have you seen that policy change recently?
So the US have kept this kind of strategic ambiguity for a very long time. But recently, Biden, in several occasions, the FT counts 4 of them, has said publicly that if China were to invade Taiwan, the US will come to the rescue. Now, it's easier said than done. I mean, lots of strategic studies institutions have conducted sort of war games to see whether that could be possible. They have different outcomes. Some of the most benevolent are that China eventually fails, but at the cost of huge losses from all sides, including the US intervening, of course. And so, to some extent, by backward induction, as people say in game theory, it kind of results that the invasion will not start. But again, this is a strategic game, so it's about what people say and how people react to what is said. And clearly, the joint declaration between Putin and Xi of 4th of February, whereby Russia has kind of made a sort of more strategic alliance with China, puts things in a totally different perspective, because we know that there is in fact an actual invasion of a country, Russia, of another sovereign country, Ukraine. This is ongoing, and China is seeing these things without necessarily intervening. So without necessarily intervening. And therefore, people think that what is happening in Ukraine might be a sort of example of what might be happening in Taiwan in a couple of years' time.
I see. I mean, maybe it's worth also sort of switching gear then. So speaking of Ukraine, to some of the more recent actions, we've seen the Germans, sort of hesitantly have agreed to finally move over sort of much needed or much requested for tanks into Ukraine. And there's been sort of similar moves by the US. I'm wondering how you think this is going to affect the potential for a Ukrainian offensive or a Ukrainian defense against a Russian offensive in the coming months.
Yeah, so the reason why we're watching so closely the Ukrainian situation is also to learn lessons for what might be happening in Taiwan. And so what we have seen is that Germany has eventually decided, after a very long period of uncertainty, of sending these tanks to Ukraine. And, after much debate, it was effectively only 14 units. So we are not talking about an entire battalion. It's like 14 tanks is more than zero, definitely, but it's not even as many as the US are sending, which is 31 M1 Abrams. Then the question became, okay, we provided the tanks, do we provide also the fighting jets? So F-16, as they've been reported in the press. For the time being, it seems like the US is against that. Also because clearly, the more you start providing this type of weapons, the more the war becomes offensive, as you suggested, rather than defensive. It's possible that the Ukrainians will start entering Russian territory, and this Russian territory now is hard to define. We already have the 4 provinces that Russia declared as annexed, but the Ukrainians say, forget about, these are our own. What about Crimea? Is it Russian territory? Is it still Ukrainian territory? This is unknown, we don't know. And unfortunately, these are all events that put everybody's narrative to test. And it's not a good thing that there's no clarity about that, exactly as there's no clarity on the status of Taiwan. Taiwan considers himself to be an independent country with his own system, a sort of democratic presidential system. And guess what? China believes to be a breakaway province, still under the Chinese umbrella, one China policy, but for the time being, they are a rebel province that needs to be brought back. So when there are so many uncertainties on the legal status of a territory, unfortunately, there's always potential for real conflict.
Sure. I mean, all of that sounds like, pretty bleak news. Is there any reason to be optimistic? Is a scenario of World War III avoidable in any way?
Well, in theory, even if there were to be an invasion or China's invasion to Taiwan, not necessarily World War III would ensue if, for example, the US gave up and decided not to engage. Then it becomes difficult because it's a question of red lines, what red lines you put, and we know how difficult it is for a US president to put red line and then not following on them. Or there might be a limited exchange between the two superpowers, and then they both realize that the potential for an enlargement of the conflict would be devastating, and then somehow return to their senses. I mean, many times US and Soviet Union came very, very close to direct confrontation, and they kind of both realized there would be mutual assured destruction, as the doctrine used to say. Fortunately, we are not there yet, although our worry is that it seems to me that Western leaders are sleepwalking into World War III. It's like, okay, I do these things, and then I do another thing, and then another thing, and then they don't realize that when you start putting all these events in a line, it seems like the trajectory, it seems unavoidable. But if world leaders continue to talk, there might be room for compromise. First, Blinken is going to, so US Secretary of State, Blinken is going to China. First member of Biden's administration to go to China since the presidency began in 2020. Then the Chinese president will visit the US in November for the APEC meeting in San Francisco. Will he take the opportunity to go to Washington and meet directly with Biden? I hope so. The point is, as long as there is some form of dialogue between the two conflicting sides, there's hope that some of these divergences might be resolved. Now, it is very hard, and that's the sense of Graham Allison's book. It's very hard when there's an incumbent power, the US, and a rising power, China. And when the rising power clearly has the intention of taking over from the incumbent power, it's very hard not to be some form of conflict. The point is, to what level this conflict needs to be. Can it be maintained under a certain threshold of being an open conflict, an open military exchange, or kind of almost inevitably will end up being kind of a conflict in the battlefields? We don't know. Even Graham Allison puts a question mark at the end of this book. He says, destined for war with a question mark. It's not a definite answer. The point is, though, that like in World War I, it takes just one Gavrilo Princip with a malfunctioning pistol in Sarajevo to shoot one bullet for World War I to start. And those kind of incidents in a fragile environment can happen every day. So the real trick here is avoiding the fragile system to develop. For the time being, I don't see many signs in these directions, but there's always room for hope.
I see. And even the talks between these world leaders that we speak of should be room for hope, but sometimes they can become, instead of occasions for clarifying their positions and starting constructive dialogue, they can become opportunities to send ultimatums, which create these sort of red lines that when they're crossed or not crossed with ambiguity, it gives the other side an excuse to sort of possibly launch an offensive they're already going to, and gives them justification to do that. So I think that might be another thing we might want to be sort of wary of. But certainly, as the sort of security situation evolves, this is, possibly the largest geopolitical challenge, if not of this decade, then maybe of the century. And I suppose time will tell. But as always, Brunello, thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thank you. Until next time.